Thank you for that very gracious introduction. A summary of Return of the Strong Gods that's clearer than anything I could say. As a professor, former recovering professor, I tend to make things more complicated, not clearer. What I want to do is I want to speak about freedom, because I want to speak about liberalism and extend forward some of the thoughts in the volume Return of the Strong Gods. So that's the thrust of my lecture this afternoon. We're living in a time of disintegration. Our governing consensus was formed during the decades after World War II. That's the thesis of my book. Although countries of the West have varying political traditions, it's fair to say that a great deal of authority has gone to the Anglo-American emphasis on liberalism. In its modern forms, this approach seeks to break down limits, boundaries, and even borders. It's plain that this kind of liberalism, what I call the open society consensus, this kind of liberalism is now unraveling. And to what degree it's unraveling remains disputed. But there can be very little doubt that concern in our societies runs deep. At every turn, our elites warn of a rising illiberalism that purportedly endangers liberal democracy. Now, truth be told, I sigh when fascism is said to be poised to return. And I tire of polemics against so-called illiberalism. Today, the woke neo-Puritanism of the left is far more likely to destroy our liberal traditions and subvert our constitutional systems of government than any tiny bands of role-playing neo-Nazis or theories of what we in America call integralism, which are advanced by a few journalists and academics. It's really the woke neo-Puritanism that's a threat to liberal democracy, not any imagined far-right threat. But I hesitate to dismiss such concerns about the future of liberal democracy. It's useful to ask why otherwise sober people get worked up. A few years ago, when I wrote The Return of the Strong Gods, I sketched out an answer to the question of why people get worked up. And I'll spare you the recapitulation of that argument today. Instead, I want to look at rising concerns about so-called illiberalism more generally and ask the question, what explains the urgent warnings that echo through our societies? Now, in my view, the panic arises because custodians of our liberal heritage suspect that its achievements are fragile, that liberal democracy is a fragile thing. And they're correct in their suspicions. This is why they protect liberalism with an ardor and passion of a lioness defending her cubs. Thus, if we want to understand the unedifying charge that Viktor Orban is an authoritarian, or that the current Polish government poses a threat to so-called European values, we must first grasp the fragility of liberalism. And to do so, I want to turn to St. Augustine. He reformulates Cicero's definition of a civitas, a body politic, in the following way. A mass of individuals, he says, becomes a public, a people, or a civitas when they are united by shared loves. The root of the city is our unity in shared loves. Liberalism proposes a shared love of freedom as the foundation of our common life. On this view, freedom is autonomy, which is a fancy Hellenistic way of saying that freedom is self-command. A liberal polity promotes and defends this shared love of freedom. Now, this afternoon, I do not intend to expound the major proponents of liberalism, nor do I wish to tangle with the critics of liberalism who claim to show that this tradition of thought is incoherent or doomed to fail. Critics of liberalism, many of whom are my friends. I will simply observe that freedom can, in fact, function as a shared love. My own country provides an obvious example. And one can look, I think, to the nations of Europe for other examples. For this reason, we should allow that liberalism has been and remains a viable political tradition, one capable of commanding loyalty and giving a distinct character to a system of government and to a way of life. But this shared love requires other loves in order to flourish and endure. And therein lies the appeal of what today's guardians of liberal democracy deride as illiberalism. For in order to flourish, our societies need the substantive loyalties to national traditions and moral truths, to say nothing of the transcendent truths of faith. Put simply, there cannot be a purely liberal society. Liberalism must be an adjective, as in liberal Spain, or liberal France, liberal Christianity, or liberal Judaism, liberal nationalism, or liberal Platonism. Liberalism cannot function on its own, and when it tries to do so, it results in bondage and tyranny, not freedom. Liberalism, therefore, cannot endure without a conservative element that sets limits and anchors our lives. So this then will be the gist of my argument, that liberalism cannot endure without conservative elements that set limits and anchor our lives. So, the argument. Let's begin by unpacking liberalism's shared love of freedom. It rests on the conviction that we are not just selfish genes, nor are we victims of our environments. We are capable of self-command, says the liberal, and it's ignoble for us to live in a way that overrides or stunts this capacity for self-command. It is this view of freedom that underwrites the modern projects of liberation. And these projects take two general forms. One aims to remove barriers, and the other seeks empowerment. The first form is found in what people now call classical liberalism. It rests on a principle of non-interference, which dictates removing traditional forms of control over personal decisions, especially control that relies upon the power of the state. In the early 19th century, English liberals put John Locke's concept of natural right into action, and they did so by removing pre-modern limits on commerce, thus vindicating the right to free use of one's property. In the middle of the 20th century, Milton Friedman, an American, championed free economic exchange as a source of social order and a source of harmony that requires minimal command over individual choices. I thought that was its great benefit. Maximum order with minimal command. Whatever form it takes, classical liberalism emphasizes what I call control reduction. It aims to clear as much space as possible for personal self-government. The second form of liberalism is also concerned with reducing limits on personal freedom, but it focuses on empowerment rather than reduction of control. Rousseau pioneered this approach. He recognized that we're social animals often dominated by society's image of our own worth and purpose, so dominated that we are unable to formulate our own sense of self. Thus, true freedom requires a therapy of authenticity and other forms of empowerment. More practically minded liberals saw that the free use of property is a dead letter if one is imprisoned in poverty. An individual's freedom to sell his labor becomes cold comfort in the face of the power of capital. These insights led to tax, welfare, and labor policies that go by the name, at least in the United States, of modern liberalism. In his influential essay, Two Concepts of Liberty, Isaiah Berlin juxtaposed these two projects. He saw the project of control reduction as guarding what he called negative liberty, while he described empowerment as pursuing positive liberty. This distinction, there is a distinction between negative and positive liberty, but Berlin wrongly framed the two goals as divergent. In truth, control reduction and empowerment have always been intertwined in the modern era. Consider, as an example, economic freedom. The elimination of pre-modern constraints on employment, investment, and trade served the cause of negative liberty, obviously, greater scope for economic activity. But these early 19th century measures worked in tandem with the development of a wide range of laws that empowered entrepreneurs, the most important of which was the limited liability corporation. In other words, the history of liberal capitalism is not just one of clearing away obstacles. It includes policies of empowerment. And we can see the same double movement of negative and positive liberty in modern projects of liberation. Racial discrimination in the American South was a vast and detailed system of state-enforced social control. In other parts of my country, more ad hoc rules for racial segregation held sway. Removing those constraints was imperative. And for example, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 forbade electoral laws designed to prevent Black Americans from voting. But the cause of negative liberty was immediately, in our history in the United States, immediately linked to empowerment and positive liberty. The same Voting Rights Act provided the legal basis for judges to require states to establish voting districts to ensure the election of Black representatives. And of course, policies like affirmative action and other aspects of the American Civil Rights Program are entirely devoted to empowerment. Feminism and sexual liberation follow the same pattern, eliminating boundaries on the one hand while emphasizing empowerment on the other. Today's liberal outlook is not satisfied with laws against employment discrimination. We're urged to give girls positive images of female achievement, and when they are young, to read to them books about female doctors and female CEOs. And the same holds for homosexuality and transgenderism. In both cases, draconian, powerful measures are urged to suppress natural instincts and encourage new attitudes so that everyone can be free to be himself. Now, classical liberals and libertarians, they're often thought of as the same in the United States, insist that we can have a free society without the interference that comes from large-scale projects of empowerment. But to my mind, John Stuart Mill's important book on liberty shows the inevitable link between negative and positive liberty. Mill notes that true liberty requires attaining psychological freedom from the controlling power of dominant social and moral norms. Without an inner freedom from the voice of social censure that comes from without, we are not able to be truly self-governing. Now, Mill temporizes on this point, suggesting that those who possess talent and refinement have the wherewithal to embark on what he calls experiments in living. But why, one asks, should be freedom limited only to the talented and the refined? If we are to have a truly liberal society, one united in a shared love of freedom, then surely we must devote ourselves to the great labor of using whatever political and culture we possess to critique, undermine, and sideline the social and moral norms that prevail. And to this effort, we must add the equally urgent and pervasive therapy of affirmation, so that those socialized in accord with the old norms are empowered to craft and embrace their own identities. So I'm arguing here that liberalism has an inherent tendency towards the progressive project of cultural liberation. And I think the progressive politics of transgenderism exemplifies this double movement, removing boundaries, but also empowerment. On the one hand, we must believe that our sex is really gender. That is to say, that it is socially constructed rather than given by nature. And this obviously enhances negative liberty by undermining the traditional norms that shape the way we think of ourselves as men and women. But this is not enough. We must also affirm girls who call themselves boys and boys who call themselves girls. We have to take with utmost seriousness their self-identifications as male and female. Accepting this duty of affirmation, and for that matter, imposing it on the recalcitrant, is necessary to secure positive liberty. It helps those who are in transition, as they say, by cheering and championing their choices. Now, obviously, in view of the difficulty of sustaining oneself as a sex that one is not, the imperative of empowerment becomes so urgent that everyone must be compelled to play his role by using correct pronouns and adopting a so-called inclusive and affirmative attitude. Now, strictly, everybody's got to play their role in the affirmation, positive liberty side of things. Now, strictly speaking, tyranny means being subject to arbitrary control. Under that definition, the fact that someone can be fired from his job for misgendering someone or hauled into court in England for hate speech does not indicate that we are living in a tyrannical regime. For the control being exercised is not arbitrary. It is more accurate to say that such a regime is totalitarian, because the threats, punishments, and coercion are entirely in accord with the logic of a society devoted to freedom above all else. So let me spell this out with analogy. I mean, the argument here is that the totalitarian political correctness arises when we devote our society to freedom above all else. So let me spell this out with an analogy. Consent of the governed to the laws of government serve as a core liberal principle. We secure this assent of the governed through elections. And in elections, no one person has a greater say than any other person. As the adage has it, one man, one vote. But we know that the freedom of all citizens to vote does not really mean that everyone has equal say. Political campaigns are costly, and rich people amplify their votes, at least in the United States. I can't speak for Spain. Rich people in the United States amplify their votes through large contributions. Now, as a remedy in the United States, we've imposed restrictions on campaign contributions. This is done to limit the political influence of wealth. But it's not hard to see that this policy of restriction only goes part of the way. Those with no means at all, no financial means at all, remain relatively impotent. For this reason, some press for the elimination of private contributions to political campaigns altogether. And they urge the establishment of a system of government-funded political campaigns, as is the case in some European countries. I don't know the situation in Spain. But even publicly funded campaigns are not enough. If we seek a perfect freedom for all to participate in our political life in a real and meaningful way, we must opt for empowerment, giving each citizen a set sum to allocate to the candidate of his choice. I would submit that progressive cultural politics is nothing other than the logic of campaign finance reform applied to every aspect of life. Whether we call it political correctness or identity of politics, such an approach seeks to reallocate social power and cultural capital so that all of us have equal freedom to determine what kind of society we're going to have going forward. The straight white male, somebody like me, is similar to the wealthy campaign contributor. As an inheritor of cultural capital, my privilege must be checked, as they say, so that I do not have a disproportionate influence on the future. Meanwhile, marginalized voices in society must be amplified, empowered. This explains the anti-Western ideology in universities, which champions non-Western traditions while treating the classics of Western literature as dangerous threats. It also explains the contradictions in programs of diversity and inclusion. In the United States, for example, nobody considers a literature department to lack diversity if the majority of its professors are women, and if most of the rest are homosexuals or persons of color. And no one blinks when activists insist that hiring a conservative Christian would threaten to undermine a university's commitment to inclusion. We have to limit the cultural capital of those at the center to increase the social power of those at the margin in order to get genuine freedom. Now I'm starting to rant here, so let me stop and return to my central point. An overly dominant liberalism has made a shared love of freedom our sole goal in society. And this has brought with it present-day cultural progressivism and its totalitarian tendencies. Over the last generation, some ask why the happenstance of being born in the West ought to dictate our moral convictions. After all, if true freedom means that my destiny should not be determined by my social class, by my race, or by my sex, why should it be determined by my culture? If we prize freedom above all else, then the most liberal thing to do is to renounce the authority of Western culture. It's not entirely new in the United States. Ralph Waldo Emerson, nearly 200 years ago, proposed the same thing. Only after, if the society is organized only around a shared love of freedom, only after every inherited authority is overturned can we be truly free to realize John Stuart Mill's ideal of experiments in living. Thus, I think in a purely liberal society, the moral relativist is not a nihilist. He is promoting freedom, the freedom to define moral truth for oneself. Now, in After Virtue, Alistair McIntyre diagnosed the moral theory of emotivism, not moral relativism. But they amount to the same thing. And McIntyre shows that a determined refusal to identify the substantive ends that constitute the good for man reduces moral and political debates to contests over power. Welcome to the 21st century in the West. As he puts it, without Aristotle, we end up with Nietzsche, who saw freedom as a prerogative of the powerful. But I want to leave McIntyre's analysis, because it's pretty compelling reductio ad absurdum of a certain singular liberalism. I want to leave McIntyre to the side. And I just want to simply observe in a more practical way how our shared love of freedom in the West has failed to create a free culture or a free society. I'm going to go through some just observations about the current climate that we're living in to show that for all of the proclamations of liberation over the last 3 generations, we actually live in a society with very little freedom. First theme, our enslavement to the hearth gods of health, wealth, and pleasure. The United States has suffered an epidemic of opioid addiction and its consequent death toll. Last year, 100,000 people died of heroin overdose in the United States. 1 million people have died over the last 15 years. Public health officials warn us that a more widespread epidemic of obesity is likely to actually have a much larger death toll in the United States. So the cultural vital signs are bad in America. Look at the cultural things like marriage rates, which are down, illegitimacy, children out of wedlock, which is up. Many people, especially those in the lower range of society, are living in bondage. Lacking self-discipline, they are unable to get their acts together, and as a result, cannot achieve even their most modest goals. Polling indicates that the overwhelming majority of young Americans want to get married, and statistically, it's unlikely that even half of them will get married. So they can't even achieve their most basic goals. And this bondage is not limited to the lower classes. Those at the top of American society are in the grip of powerful fears. The most talented young people I meet are terrified of taking a wrong step, a single wrong step, as they navigate the gauntlet to gain the right credentials, the right honors, the right internships. They worry inordinately about getting a bad grade, or God forbid, saying something on social media that will cause them to be canceled. Gen X folks spend hours in the gym. Baby boomers my age are locked in a losing struggle not to get old. As I've written recently, were my late grandfather to survey the current scene, he would be shocked, not by the hedonism, but by the iron discipline, by the self-administered whippings that elite people give to themselves. Polling indicates that among the young in the United States, even sex, the preoccupation of our entertainment industry is in decline. Far from a culture of freedom, anything remotely carefree and adventuresome seems impossibly remote, even to society's so-called winners. Our next theme, pervasive sense of fragility and fear. Young people in America at expensive universities insist that they are vulnerable and easily hurt, and institutions respond by promising to provide so-called safe spaces. When Trump was elected in 2016, people wept. Since then, the fever has only worsened. People on the left and on the right regularly announce a coming apocalypse. We often hear from those who fear a return of Hitler, for example. And of course, the response to the COVID pandemic has been powered by a deep fear of death, so much so that we are prohibited from accompanying the dying, or we were for a period of time prohibited from accompanying the dying and burying the dead. As Giorgio Agamben noted, over the last 2 years, the West has willingly embraced the barbarism of bare life. Say what you want about America or Europe in the 21st century. These are not qualities of a free society. As Thomas Hobbes understood very well, fear is the great and primordial enemy of freedom. Next theme, technocracy, materialism, and determinism. We live amidst remarkable paradoxes. We're in the grip of a culture feverishly determined to free us from every hindrance, even those imposed by our bodies. And yet, whether it's through brain science, sociobiology, or economic theory, our leading educational institutions instill in our elite the conviction that human beings are largely determined by economic interests, by DNA, or by some other material cause. Although social scientists like Steven Pinker at Harvard University no doubt disdain the woolly theorizing of literary critics, our postmodern savants also boil life down to the supposedly fundamental drives of sexual desire, will to power, or some term like fear of difference. I mean, just consider the notion of white privilege. This notion serves as a law of social life for those who advance it, as implacable and certain as the law of supply and demand. Now, I'm not surprised by the materialist and determinist consensus that runs from sociology through the study of literature in the 21st century. It's, after all, determinism is necessary for technocracy, the legitimacy of which turns on following the science, as they say. And science does not have a place for human freedom. Even psychology, insofar as it purports to be a science of the soul, operates without a strong concept of freedom. So today, our societies are dominated by liberal elite, a freedom-affirming elite that advances a love of freedom. But that same elite possesses no deep insights, because of their education, possesses no deep insights into the nature of freedom. This leads to one of the deepest paradoxes of our time. And this paradox is the Francis Bacon-inspired ambition to engineer culture, even to the point of micromanaging pronouns, so that everyone can be truly and finally free. Now, that is a great paradox, because a managed culture, even more so than a managed economy, may claim to serve freedom, and that's certainly what the Soviet economy claimed to do, manage economy in the service of freedom. It may claim to serve freedom, but it produces the opposite, as today's woke totalitarianism demonstrates. A final theme: cynicism, skepticism, and pervasive irony. Now, another paradox is the combination of idealistic activism in the present moment and a pervasive sense of impotence and exhaustion. Perhaps the former, perhaps the idealism is adapted as a therapy to help us deal with the latter, with the sense of exhaustion and futility. Whatever the relation between this idealism and despair, I'm struck by the desperation implicit in the claim that history is on the side of justice. This is often a claim that progressives in America use. There's a kind of desperation in this claim. The turn of phrase suggests a benevolent determinism, one that vindicates progressive idealism while conceding the late modern suspicion that we're under the thumb of powers beyond our control. As Peter Thiel notes in 0 to 1, this is his philosophical treatise masquerading as a business book. As he notes, a great deal of our thinking from science to investment strategies has shifted from trying to understand causes so that we can use our intelligence and freedom to engineer better outcomes. It has shifted to developing algorithms so that we can stand atop whatever wave happens to come our way. Although less immediately damaging than our fear, cynicism also undermines freedom. In my experience, American university students can throw themselves into the latest woke causes and fashion themselves countercultural, and then, on a turn of a dime, apply for a McKinsey consultancy position. I've listened to conversations which young people toggle back and forth effortlessly between ardent statements about social justice to Machiavellian calculations about how to advance their careers. And all of this is a far cry from the 1960s. One sees today's culture most vividly in those who are coming of age, the young. And what I see suggests that liberalism's love of freedom is failing in the West, not succeeding. Although Americans born in the early 20th century fought on the battlefields of Europe and in the Pacific, and my generation grew up under the shadow of nuclear holocaust, today's young people seem to harbor a far greater fear of death. And while my grandparents married and had children in the depths of the Great Depression, Even the most talented young people I know who have bright prospects for the future are far more in the thrall of a fear of not having enough money. And I went to high school during the final years of the old middle class consensus, which was often punitive and could be very punitive of those who were awkward, deviant, and odd. But from what I can observe, the anxiety of my peers when I was young, that they might be excluded or judged, pales in comparison to the fear that today's high school students now have of being shamed on social media. And fear, as I've already observed, is a great, great enemy of freedom. Now, I've defined, so I think we live, quite frankly, in a society where freedom is on the lips of many, but it's experienced by very few. I mean, I've told a friend of mine, if this is a culture of freedom, I don't want to have anything to do with it, the moment that we live in today. I can cross any border I want, but I just think people are in much more bondage than they were when I was young. Now, I've defined freedom as autonomy, which is to say self-command. Let me put it more simple, even more simply. Freedom means doing what you want to do. And this, I believe, is how St. Paul understands freedom when he tells us that it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. As he observes, we're in bondage to sin and death, and we are actually not doing that which we wish to do. And we are doing the very things that we hate. That's the gist of Romans chapter 7. We do not, in fact, do those things that we want to do. And this kind of bondage is all too evident throughout the West. Having organized our societies around a singular love of freedom, we have significantly eroded the sources of freedom. And those sources rest in our substantive loves, the strength of our substantive loves, and not in our declarations of independence. Freedom, in other words, arises from the power to say no. And this power is found in loves that are stronger than our fears. So freedom takes its origin in our capacity to say no. Now, the Jewish tradition grasps this fundamental truth about freedom. Among the Hebrew words for freedom in the Old Testament, I'll give a little rabbinic digression now. Among the words in the Old Testament for freedom two are prominent. One is hofesh. It's used in Exodus 21:2. And this verse stipulates that male Hebrew slaves must be freed after 6 years of service. And the other is dror, found in Leviticus 25:10, which commands that freedom shall be proclaimed throughout the land during the year of Jubilee. Incidentally, this verse from Leviticus 25:10, this verse is inscribed on the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, a famous monument of freedom in my country. And the same word, dror, is used in Isaiah 61:1, which tells us that the coming Messiah will bring liberty to the captives. So rich words for freedom, but it's interesting to note that Jews do not focus on these terms. For them, the central word for freedom is herut. It's the word associated with the Passover celebration of liberation, herut. And it's really a very odd choice of words. Herut appears in 1 Kings 25:8, where it is translated as elders or ministers. In other words, those who are specially dedicated to God's service. And how does that get to be freedom? And stranger still is the path by which that word comes to mean freedom in the rabbinic tradition. Here's how it does. The ancient rabbis substituted herut for harut, different vowel, in Exodus 32:16. And in Hebrew, there are vowel markings, not letters. And in the Torah, in the 5 scrolls of the Bible, those vowels are absent. So you just get the consonants. So the fact that they put a different vowel in is not as crazy as it seems. And in that verse, harut, the word that's being replaced, that word means engrave. God has engraved, harut, the 10 commandments on the stone tablets that Moses carries down from Mount Sinai. So thus, through the twists and turns of rabbinic reasoning, engrave really means dedicate, which really means freedom. Now, unlike Christianity, Judaism often articulates core doctrines through striking and sometimes counterintuitive interpretations of biblical verses, and this is a classic case of that. And here we have the ancient rabbis defining freedom in this fashion. Engrave means dedicate, means freedom. To be free, in other words, we must engrave God's commandments on our hearts. Now, of course, the rabbis are not inventing this definition of freedom. It's expressed in the prophetic promise of Jeremiah 31:33. And this is what God says, I will put my law within them, and I will engrave it on their hearts. And the same view of freedom dominates the New Testament. Hebrews 8:10 quotes that verse from Jeremiah. And in many places, St. Paul teaches that faithful obedience to Christ brings freedom. With the law of Christ engraved on our hearts, we are able to say no to the worldly powers that seek to dominate our lives. And thus we are free. Now, we don't need to adopt a Jewish or Christian faith to see that truth in the definition of, to see the truth that's in this definition of freedom as herut. And by the way, I think it was Francois Bellamy, his observation that we don't have to be a majority to shape public life. And I would say here that this question about recovering freedom is a classic example of where Christian freedom can be an inspiration to those living in bondage in our societies and can cause them to give us cultural and political power to reshape the West because they want to be free, they don't want to be in bondage. So you don't have to be Jew or a Christian to recognize the truth of this definition of freedom as having something engraved on your heart. After all, I've described freedom as autonomy or self-command. Quite simply, freedom means doing what we want to do rather than doing what others tell us to do. Or to use St. Augustine's formulation, my love is my weight. If I love something, I'm drawn toward it, and I want to act in accord with my love rather than as others command me to act. Thus, the more powerful our loves, the greater freedom we enjoy. This is the basic insight, I think, of the rabbis and St. Paul. To translate the theological view of freedom to a political view, to say that the more that the law of Christ is engraved in our hearts, the freer that we are. I'm saying that the political translation is the more powerful our loves, the greater our freedom. The power of love's yes allows us to say no to anything that runs counter to that which we truly desire. As an aside, I'll skip that aside because it's a separation of powers very unique to the United States. So let me then return to my main theme and recapitulate the ground that I've covered. Liberalism urges us to love freedom, and it seeks to erect a city founded on this shared love of freedom. But the more liberalism succeeds, the less freedom we have. As we organize our society around a singular love of freedom, we erode freedom's deepest sources, which rest in the strength of our other loves. So if we love freedom to the exclusion of our other loves, we will have a society of bondage, not freedom. The paradox is we need to love things other than freedom in order to be free. Now, illiberalism is an even muddier concept than liberalism, which is not surprising since it functions as a negation rather than an affirmation, illiberalism. So for my purposes, I will define illiberalism as a vision of society ordered towards ordered to shared loves of a range of substantive goods and goods other than the singular love of freedom. And the ends sought by loves other than freedom are many and various, which is why it's a muddy concept. It can be a love of matrimonial union and family loyalties, a love of local and regional realities. It can be a love of the beauty of our own native language and the great literary monuments of our culture. It can be a patriotic sentiment of our native land. For those who have talents for speculation and for philosophy, can feel the lure of transcendence and a love of truth. And of course, religious faith is the highest and most powerful love. Now, in each instance, we develop loyalties that empower us to say no to whatever undermines or contradicts our loves. In the power of the no, we attain the freedom of doing what we want rather than what others command us to do. We live in accord with truths whose authority we affirm and embrace, rather than in accord with our fickle, ever-changing desires, or even more often in accord with the demands of commerce, mass culture, or ideology. Now, what I've adumbrated here is obviously just traditional conservatism. And this traditional conservatism insists that a just society must propose a substantive vision of human goods to its members, and especially to the young as they are educated. Moreover, a just society must vest appropriate power in authorities that are entrusted to promote and protect these goods, these substantive goods. I'll just give a concrete example. Worship is a fundamental good, and political authority ought to encourage religious worship. This doesn't mean that politicians should lead church services or that clergy should govern. Rather, government power should be used to promote and protect the virtue of religion. And we already do so in the United States. To the dismay of those who seek a purely liberal polity, the American Constitution provides a right of free exercise of religion, and this accords a special right to those who are religious. And in my youth, we had a variety of Sabbath laws that fenced off Sundays from the invasion of commerce and the dominion of mammon. And I think I could imagine certain ways in which the use of political power in the United States could be used to reinstitute a modest defense of the Sabbath in my own context. Now, unlike liberalism, traditional conservatism lacks a singular focus, and it attains an only vague theoretical expression. Perhaps it must be so, for a great deal turns on prudential judgment about what goods should be prized and how much power to accord the authorities that promote these goods. I count myself what I would call a liberal conservative. That means that I urge tolerance of the inevitable plurality of goods promoted in a society as vast and heterogeneous as our own societies, especially the United States. And I certainly, as a good American, urge caution in the degree of power backed up by state sanctions that are to be accorded to the cultural, moral, and religious authorities that are custodians of the substantive goods that we all need. But let me conclude by saying that I am certain that a genuinely liberal society, which I seek, a society capable of sustaining a culture of freedom, requires these substantive goods. And moreover, it requires the authorities accorded proper protection by political authority. It requires the cultural, and religious authorities that form us in our love of those substantive goods. Put simply, without the leaven of something that participates in the illiberal spirit of honoring authority and devoting oneself to something other than freedom, liberalism fails. So just simply, without something of the illiberal spirit, liberalism fails. Without, to use the language of my book, without the strong gods, we cannot sustain liberalism. In my estimation, or liberal democracy broadly, in my estimation, our Christian heritage has formed the West in ways that rightly encourage in us a love of freedom. And in that sense, liberalism taps into something true. It's certainly true of my own country, this shared love of freedom. But to vindicate that love, we must share other loves. And we must order our societies to honor, promote, and protect those loves. In closing, if we're to taste the sweetness of freedom, then we need the salt of what today's liberals foolishly deride as far right and illiberal. Thank you.